Welcome to the next episode of the HR Mavericks podcast. I'm Garrett Justice, and today I'm joined by Phil Strazzulla, who is an entrepreneur, investor, and founder of Select Software Reviews. Phil, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks a lot for having me.
It's great to have you on the show. How's the beautiful weather in Boston today?
It's good. It's still beautiful. We've got another couple months left before it's horrible and we question
I
why we live here. But today we're grateful.
Yeah, hang on to that, right? I get that. I lived in Minnesota for a few years, so I know how that goes, right? That winter's coming quick. So, anyways, it's great to have you on the show. I'm excited to dive into our topic today. And some of our guests might have heard your brief intro of a founder of a software review site, something like that, right? And think, what does this have to do with HR? So you do have a ton of experience, especially when it comes to like the HR industry and tools in that space. So tell our listeners a little bit more about your own career background and also what Select Software Reviews does.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been in HR/HR software for the last 10 years. I originally started my career off working at venture capital firm that invested in a bunch of this stuff like LinkedIn and Cornerstone and a bunch of other companies. But I always wanted to start my own business. So I went to business school, taught myself how to program, and then started a tool that basically just helped companies to fight against Glassdoor reviews and build their own employer brand. 3 to 4 years ago, I hired somebody to run that on a day-to-day basis as a general manager. Want to start another business. I love to learn. I love to teach. And I saw that a lot of companies really struggle with tool selection. I think there are about 30,000 HR tools out there at last count. That's a lot, especially if you're a smaller business. And so it's hard to know what tools to look at, how much to pay for them, how to get your boss to say yes, how to implement them correctly. And so we give that advice on Select Software Reviews. We talk to who we think are the smartest people ops, HR, recruiting folks out there and just kind of pick their brain. I just did an interview all about employee experience tech. We do, payroll, HRIS, ATS, like all this stuff to help people just be more successful. And it's all free. We have a community where people can ask questions and newsletter, all that good stuff.
That's awesome. And it's definitely needed. I moved into the HR space just a year and a half ago. Right. And it's kind of my introduction into that space. And it's insane how many different tools are out there. And it's confusing and it's a mess for especially like those small businesses where you might have an owner who's doing the HR work or, one of those accidental HR people might be your office manager and they're kind of tasked with, okay, what's the right solution to purchase? And not only that, but it's so fragmented with, do we need something for payroll? Do we need something for HRIS, hiring, all of those different things, right? So I definitely see the need. Excuse me, definitely see the need there. And it's definitely needed. So tell me a little bit more about what drew you to the HR space specifically.
I've always been interested in people's career paths. How does somebody become, I don't know, the CEO of a company or something like that? And it's sort of a cliche, but we spend more time at work than anything else really in our lives. And so it's this really important aspect of everyone's experience on this planet. And so I think there was always this like latent interest in it. And the way I kind of got into it was building an app to help people understand what are career paths like. What's it like to be a private equity investor or to work as a product manager at Google or something like that. And through doing this thing that I was just really interested in, I realized like, oh, companies want to share this information, right? Like if you're Google, you want to share what it's like to be a product manager. And this is 10 years ago before employer branding was as big as it is today. And so I realized, oh, I can actually make this a business. It's not just like a side project. And as I sort of got more and more immersed into it, I started, talking to 3 or 4 HR people every single day. And you just get into it. You're like, oh, okay, this is sort of like the heartbeat of a lot of companies. How can I continue to make an impact in this space? And it just sort of, led me down this rabbit hole that a decade later, I'm still here.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's a perfect, precursor for our topic today, because I'm really excited about this topic. I just want to pick your brain more on this idea of how did HR evolve to where it is today, right? Because, you've seen the past decade and even before that, I mean, one of the first in the field was ADP in the 50s, right? Like starting, the first thing that became the payroll software company, ADP. So I want to get your take on it, because you have been in this space for the past decade plus, and you work with all of these different software providers and tools in this space. And so I think that gives you a unique perspective to be able to share with us, what you've seen, how it's evolved, and what you think is coming next. So, really to start that off, what would you say are some of the latest trends in HR that you have seen most recently?
Sure. So, like most people, I'm very biased, and I'll start off with a trend around technology. In 1999, I think like iCIMS was the first hosted, SaaS HR technology platform as an applicant tracking system. And we've just seen a crazy explosion in tools. And you've got sort of your platforms that everybody needs, like an HRIS or a payroll system or an ATS if you're growing. But then you've got all these sort of niche use case tools that can help with scheduling, with assessments. And it's not just assessments, it's like, this one's for sales assessments, this one's for engineers, this one's for personality. And so you can get these high-powered tools that are allowing companies to be a lot more effective, because HR is like, oh, okay, we've got a problem with retention and customer success. Let's do a better job of explaining what it's like to do that on the website. So that's like the employer branding thing. Let's do a better assessment. Let's have a better candidate experience, better onboarding, et cetera. And we're all sort of targeting that one pain point of customer success retention through these different modalities and supported by tools. And so I think tools has sort of been like the exoskeleton for HR teams to leverage, whether you're doing HR as a founder, which honestly, I actually am. We're a 20-person company. We don't have an HR person, or you're an HR team of one or 100. That's really been a huge thing. And I think where we're going next is we're just going to continue to leverage these smart tools. So we've all heard of artificial intelligence. I think some people think it's going to take my job or something like that. But I think the reality is it's just like software that's smarter than the average, workflow tool. It's not just a database. It's a database that can look at the data and maybe do something. Yeah. A really good example of this is a tool called Hirefly, which is just top of mind for me. Mm-hmm. And it's a new company. It's only a year old, but essentially what you do is you upload a job rec and it reads it. The machine reads it and it says, hey, okay, it looks like you're looking for a Java engineer in Boston with 5 years experience. Is that right? And you're like, yeah, good job, machine. And they're like, okay, cool. We're going to go find 20 candidates on the internet, and we're going to go to Twitter and GitHub and LinkedIn, all this other stuff. And we're going to email those people. And the people who respond positively about wanting to meet with you, will just double check that they're actually really good, and we'll put them on your calendar. And so this AI sourcing tool, I guess you might want to call it, allows an HR person or a founder or a leader in a business to be super effective, because all you had to do is write that job description. The next day, you've got a couple candidates in your inbox that are pre-vetted and they're on your calendar. Like, that's pretty amazing. And the tool is a lot cheaper than a human is. Yeah. So that sort of stuff is really cool. And you can apply the AI sort of framework to everything from, answering the same employee questions over and over and over again about PTO or whatever, to employee onboarding, to basically anything you can think of.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's very fascinating. The bar has definitely been lowered. I was reading some research, and just this morning actually, and if I'm trying to remember so I can get this right, I think that they've been doing this survey for, since 97, I think was the first year that they did it. First year they did this survey among HR professionals. The smallest company on average that was purchasing HR software was like a 1,500 person company, right? And today, based on that survey, it's about a 5-person company, right? So the barrier to entry there has been lowered because there are so many tools and they are affordable. Now the challenge is, which one do you need and when do you need them? And I think that's kind of a key thing that a lot of, especially small businesses, think about. Is this crucial right now, or do I wait, or when do I do this? Especially when you don't, like you mentioned, 20-person company, you might not have an in-house HR expert with that background. You have people who are kind of filling in and doing that until you get to a bigger size, right?
Yeah, many times if you have an HR specialist, unless they're spending a lot of their time staying on top of the HR tech landscape, they might not really know what's out there. They might be using tools from 5, 10 years ago because that's sort of like the thing that they were introduced to, and they're still using that system. And realistically, if you're an HR team of one, you're not going to spend a lot of time understanding the landscape because you're dealing with employee relations issues. The payroll didn't run, it's open enrollment, like all this stuff, right? And so it's really challenging to understand what you should be adopting. And these tools aren't free. Like they cost a decent amount of money, and maybe even more important, they take a lot of time to do them correctly and buy-in from your organization. And you can pretty quickly use your internal social capital up if you are trying to do something that the rest of the group just kind of doesn't like. And that's why I was talking to this woman earlier today who's bought, I don't know, maybe 50 HR solutions over her career. And one of the things she loves to do is just get like 4 or 5 people from across the company to use something in a demo before we actually purchase it, to get their buy-in, to get their feedback, to pick the right tool, but also to get their buy-in. So when you buy it, roll it out, you've got somebody in operations and sales, whatever, who are like, yeah, this is great. I actually helped out on this.
Yeah, that makes total sense and a great suggestion. So I'm curious how COVID has changed how we view HR. I mean, there's so many impacts. We hear about it all the time and, in the news, but, from your perspective, what are the biggest changes that have come about since COVID?
So I'll give you sort of the data. We get a lot of interesting data on like what people are actually like looking for and purchasing in terms of tools, which is cool. At the beginning of COVID, everything shut down. Maybe a week or two into it, April 2020, people started buying virtual everything, virtual interview software, video interview software, virtual onboarding, et cetera. I think in the first week of April, the interest in video interview software was up like 600%, like week over week, like pretty crazy stuff. Then companies were like, wow, we're all depressed working from home and dealing with this pandemic thing. Let's get employee recognition and employee engagement, employee mental health. And then towards the end of the pandemic or the end of that first year, it was kind of like, how do we do more with less? Because we need to now like rehire tons of people or whatever. There's just like too much work to do. And so the interest in artificial intelligence really spiked. And I think that what's cool to me as a nerd, and maybe the definition of not cool, but people are just like better understanding how to leverage technology, whether it's people analytics and doing like really sophisticated stuff around strategic workforce planning. Like, hey, like we've got, these 3 futures for our company. If this happens, we're going to need to hire this many people. If this happens, we're going to have to reorg, et cetera, utilizing AI, utilizing like all these really sophisticated point solutions. And I think that that's mirroring where people ops in HR is heading, which is much more of a strategic driver for the company versus the administrator who is taking, it's not Toby from The Office. It's like somebody who's not in the show in The Office, who's really competent at their job, like pushing the business forward.
Yeah, and that's actually my next question. So I want to double click on that if we can, of just, where is HR going? What do you think where do you see it evolving in the future? And so you kind of hinted at some of that, of HR becoming a more strategic player rather than an administrative function. Is that right?
That's right. So it's a tough bet to make, I think, because realistically, prior to the pandemic, we had this 10-year bull market, unemployment record lows. And to be honest with you, when I went into the talent acquisition teams at even decent companies, they were not super high performing. I think the answer to many questions was, let's just get more recruiters, let's get more bodies versus like, let's be more efficient. Mm-hmm. However, I think in the last year or two, whatever it is, there are more and more outsiders coming in. So people who are like, the CFO, head of marketing, et cetera, coming in with different skill sets, different mentalities, a more business-focused mentality, to be honest with you. And then there are a lot of HR and people ops and recruiting people who are like, yeah, I'm going to get on this bandwagon. I'm going to sort of reframe how I think about my job and my career path. HR, like every other part of the organization and our economy, every 5 to 10 years, it's just going to be completely new. And there are going to be some people who change and evolve, and some people who come in And then there's going to be some people who just don't. And if you're listening to this podcast and trying to, better yourself, you're almost certainly not in that latter category. But I think for sure there are a lot of people who are just not going to keep up, and they're going to not really have their pick of the litter when it comes to their career opportunities.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I want to bring this back to, kind of what we talked about at the beginning is, tools, right? HR tools. And that's one of the changes that you've seen, especially, recently in the HR space. And, something that kind of stood out to me that you said that I fully believe, especially for, much of our audience listening to this are small business owners, solo HR people. And it's the role of tools, HR tools, especially in a small business, because I think it's a key piece of exactly what you hinted at where HR is going, right? When HR as a function can evolve to be a strategic partner in the business. And some do that well, some don't. And a lot of small businesses, you have an HR function that's just administrative, right? And part of the evolution from administrative to strategic is having the right tools and resources in place so that you're not doing everything manually, right? It's not just an administrative function, getting people to sign paperwork or whatever it is, right? That it is a lot of that, because there's so many great tools out there, you can be so much more efficient in doing that work. So you have more time to reinvest in people and strategy. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that there are many organizations and individuals who get that. And you need both. Like if you have a
Yeah.
rock star HR person in a company where they sort of view HR as Toby from the office, then it doesn't matter, right? Like they're not going to give them the resources. They're not going to listen to them. There's just a bias. And maybe that bias has been built up through experience, but like it still exists and it's still a hindrance to actually collaborating. But when you gel those two things together, you're going to see a lot of progress. And I think the best examples of this are companies that got it a really long time ago, like Google, Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, BCG. Like these are some of the best run companies in the world. And they realized basically from the get-go that people ops recruiting is the blood of their business. Like that's like the lifeblood, sorry, not the actual blood, the lifeblood of their business. And in order to succeed in the marketplace, they need to align their organization with that function. And you're just seeing, it used to be 0.1% of companies, maybe now it's 15%, and hopefully that'll continue to grow and grow.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right too. So bringing this back to, again, like those small businesses, if there's a small business, someone in a small business who's listening to this and they have that desire, right, to elevate HR, to be more strategic, to have the right tools and processes and resources in place, like a lot of those big companies that you just named, where would you recommend they start?
I think you need to start with understanding how HR can make an impact in your business. So a lot of CEOs, they view HR as pencil pusher. But if you start to think, okay, the reason we didn't hit last quarter's number is because we didn't have enough technicians. Okay, so we need to recruit better, we need to retain better, maybe we need to onboard better, maybe we need to train better. All these ways that HR can make a difference. Okay, what's the ROI of that? Okay, how do we make that investment? Do we have the right leader in place? Maybe you don't have the right HR person and you need to go find somebody, and that person might have an HR background, they might not. A lot of the best performing HR people that I've met in the last decade have come from other functions, and it might take them a year or two to kind of learn the ropes, but because they come in with a different mentality, maybe a different level of aggressiveness, they can be super, super effective, and they can learn the blocking and tackling stuff pretty fast as well. So you've got to understand how it can make an impact, and then go find the right leader and then resource them. Give them the ability to go buy the right HRIS, the right LMS, time and attendance systems, recruiting systems, all these different things to actually allow them to do their job. Otherwise, you can't just have a human and say, hey, go, figure out how to 3x the number of technicians we have. That's not going to work. They need tools. They might not need headcount as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Phil, this has been an awesome conversation. Really appreciate you joining and sharing some of your insights and some of the things you're seeing in the space. As we kind of wrap up here, one of the questions I like to ask a lot of our guests is, what's a commonly held belief in HR, especially among small businesses, that you just passionately disagree with?
So in the last 10 years, you meet people at parties or whatever, and they're like, what do you do for a living? And I say something, something HR. And then people are like, HR. And they're like, HR, they're the police. And I think that a lot of employees and probably a lot of C-level executives kind of view HR as the police, right? Like they're there for the employee relations issues. They are kind of doing some admin stuff in addition. And I totally disagree with that. I think, obviously somebody's got to be sort of enforcing the rules or whatever, or there when there are employee relations issues. But realistically, like your HR team is an asset in your business that can drive your organization forward, and it should be treated as such. And that might mean that you need to augment or change the team. It might mean you need to augment or change the tooling or whatever. But once you start thinking about it in that way, you might be surprised at how much it can perform and make an impact. And you'll certainly be surprised over the long term if you make the right investment.
Amen. Couldn't add anything to that. I think that's absolutely right. So, Phil, thanks again for taking the time to be with us today. If there are any listeners that want to get in contact with you or learn more about, this topic or your company, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. So you can find me on LinkedIn fairly easily, Phil Strazzulla with 2 Z's and 2 L's. I'm the only one out there. You can also go to selectsoftwarereviews.com if you're looking at tools or you want to ask our community a question or join our newsletter.
Awesome. Thank you, Phil. Hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks. You too.